Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. TV legend Esther Rantzen, presently fighting her own battle with serious illness, has called on all MPs to attend a debate in Parliament about changing the laws on assisted dying. It's a conversation that might go on forever as we weigh up medical ethics versus personal choice. Today I'm going to endeavour to begin that conversation with my guests MP Andrew Bridgen, who feels the laws should stay as they are, and activist Peter Tatchell, who says it's time for change. Good evening, both gents. Andrew, if I come to you first, sir, what are your concerns about the possibility of modifying, changing substantially the rules on assisted dying?
Well, this is not the first time that Parliament's debated this. We debated and voted on it last time in 2015. I spoke against the motion and voted against it, and it went down. I don't think the fundamental facts have not changed since that debate 9 years ago. I think we have to remember that despite lots of people lobbying, the ones in my constituency and from around the country who are in favour of assisted dying or the right to decide for themselves, they're generally very strong characters, quite capable of standing up for themselves. But Neil, I think we have to remember the law is there to protect the weakest in society. Very often the strongest can look after themselves. And I was approached in 2015 by a large number of doctors who had grave reservations about any changes in the law to legalise assisted dying, questions around the ethics that they'd have to operate under and the oaths they've given when they became medics to do no harm, who was going to administer all of this, and grave concerns that vulnerable elderly would feel pressured either by society or by their relatives to end their lives prematurely. And if we've got a choice between 19 people who want to end their lives and can't, and one person who doesn't want to and is coerced into it, I'll go with the latter.
Peter Tatchell, Andrew Bridgen, saying there that the vulnerable are always at risk by definition. In what way would you say that the law can be changed to meet the needs of those who wish to have an assistance in dying, and those who might one way or another find themselves manoeuvred into that position against their better judgment?
Well, first let me say that 84% of the public and the vast majority of doctors say that where someone has a terminal illness and hasn't got long to live, where they're suffering, or where they have an illness that is physically damaging and harmful to them, causing them pain, they should have the option to choose when and where and how they die. Now, I understand people's concerns about safeguards, but Baroness Meach's bill has very strong safeguards. So assisted dying would have to be approved by 2 independent doctors plus a High Court judge. It could only be applied for by a person aged 18 or older who was of sound mind, who had given their permission freely, and who had a terminal illness with less than 6 months to live. So those are very strong safeguards. And I think, when it comes to dying, during life, we all expect a good quality life. I think people should also have the right to a good quality of death. Prolonged suffering, agony that I've seen a couple of my friends go through is not kind, it's not compassionate, it's not what we should accept.
Andrew Bridgen, it does sound, from what Peter's saying, that the safeguards are there, that the process as laid down, properly followed, ought to protect the vulnerable and everyone else. But you clearly suspect that there are workarounds in there that would be to the detriment of some.
Well, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We've seen in Canada that they've brought in legalised assisted dying, and we've had the terrible situation where a young lady in her 20s has suffered catastrophic vaccine harms from the COVID-19 vaccines, and as a make-up, the state are now offering her assisted dying as a way out, as a compensation. That's things in both the legal system and in our hospitals don't always go according to the protocols, as we know, and not always the protocols are right. I think this would be very much the thin end of the wedge. I think it devalues the lives of those who might seek that were put in this position, but I think it actually devalues life in general, and I think it'll be a very, very dangerous step and the thin end of a wedge.
Peter, the Canadian situation, I would say, is troubling. I've been watching developments in Canada with great interest and a lot of concern. Is Andrew Bridgen right to say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Does this open the door? What you're describing sounds protected by plenty of safeguards, but is it the on-ramp to a wider motorway that could lead to where Canada is now?
I understand those concerns, but the bill, as presented by Baroness Meacher, does not give any get-outs, does not give any possibility of expansion or extension. It is very, very tightly defined. And that's why so many doctors support it. They understand the need to protect the vulnerable, and I agree. But if you look at Canada, that's not a model that's being proposed here in the UK. And of course, there are other countries like Belgium, New Zealand, and 6 Australian states where they have similar policies and they are working well. The feared abuses have not happened. And we need to say, and I say this as a person who saw 2 of my friends die very long, painful deaths, to see them for week after week, month after month, suffering in agony with no prospect of any cure, that was just so painful. It was so painful for them and for me to watch it, knowing that they had no hope of any cure, no hope of any treatment. They did have palliative care, but it wasn't good enough. It didn't prevent the pain and suffering.
Andrew Eborn, you're a lawyer. You understand that this from a legal perspective also. How do we help doctors and patients walk the ethical tightrope between what seems decent and what might be illegal?
Sure, you're absolutely right. And under the Suicide Act 1961, just to be clear about this, assisted suicide is an offence. It's punishable by up to 14 years in prison. Peter's absolutely right. There's a quality of life. You're entitled to right to life, but also dignity in death. And I think what Andrew's talking about with respect is about the safeguards, if you like, to make sure those safeguards are in. What's currently before Parliament is you're putting those safeguards in. And I think that's what you need to look at. The people deserve a quality of basically being eased out of pain, if you like. And there's some of the terrible circumstances that we hear about, and Esther Rantzen, to her credit, has spoken very publicly about that. What we need to do is make sure that you can get dignity for people so they don't have to go abroad, they don't have to be away from their loved ones, and they can have dignity in death as well as in life.
Andrew Bridgen, it has always been the case, or it has been the case for as long as I can remember. We all know that people at the end of life, sometimes at home, who have no prospect of recovery, are possibly unconscious, and are very much hovering in the departure lounge, are helped on their way with morphine or similar interventions. So it's there, isn't it? Assisted dying, whether we confront it face to face or not, is already with us.
Yes, well, people, quite rightly ask for pain relief during a terminal illness, and if that pain relief is of a higher and higher doses to conquer the pain, eventually that will induce death, and that is a side effect. But Peter talks about the protections in this bill. Well, it is indeed, it will be a bill, and bills can be amended. And I'd ask your viewers to remember that income tax was only brought in as a temporary measure to pay for the Napoleonic Wars. We've still got it now, and it's been extended many, many times. That's what we're opening Pandora's box on.
That is a contentious point, I suppose, and it's also a valid point that once you open the door, all things are possible in the future. But what I think occurs to me is that Andrew in Parliament in another context has sought desperately to have a conversation about excess deaths to no avail. It falls on deaf ears, and I do wonder. Here's now assisted dying. That. I do wonder whether enough attention is paid to life, the absolute bright, shining light of life. Now we're having, when it comes to dying, it would appear the more the merrier.
I don't think anybody wants anybody to die, and certainly supporters of this bill do not want anybody to die for suffering ages and ages and ages. We don't want to see that suffering. It's about the relief of suffering. And I think that's an understandable and very legitimate concern. As I said, I witnessed two friends going through months and months of agony. The palliative care was as good as it could get, but it wasn't good enough. They were really, really suffering. To see the grimaces on their faces, the tears, it was just heartbreaking. And I wouldn't want anybody to go through that. I think we just have to give people a choice with these safeguards so that they can end their life with dignity.
Peter Tatchell, Andrew Bridgen, it's such a painful, literally a painful subject. Barely even been able to touch, I suppose, on the ethics as it applies to and as it affects, doctors trying to do what's right. But thank you both. Andrew Bridgen, you, I think, have had some first-hand experience in your constituency from those who have raised very specific concerns relating to this.
Yes, in 2015, I was approached by a local doctor who told me how he'd taken the time to actually visit my office and explain his grave concerns about assisted dying. He also said that he thought that a large number of doctors just ethically didn't sign up for this and wouldn't be willing to do it. And ultimately he said he wanted to work in the National Health Service, not the National Death Service. And he told me about being called out to an aged lady, and she'd stopped breathing, and he was actually administering CPR to her. And he said at the bottom of the bed, the relatives were deciding which of her houses they were going to have. And he said, you should have seen their faces when I brought the lady back to life. And he said if it had been up to the relatives, there's no way that she'd have been around. And that was his story to me. Obviously distressing to hear, Andrew, but where does it place GPs? You know, if a GP is approached by a family, by a patient requesting assistance in this way, are they obligated in terms of their ethics to assist, or can they say that this is just simply a practice they're not prepared to follow? Well, currently, as the law stands today, assisting someone to commit suicide is a criminal offence. But clearly, as doctors qualify through medical school, they give an oath to their patients to do no harm. And clearly, what we'd be asking qualified doctors to do, if it is to help someone to end their life prematurely, that would be doing harm. We'd be asking qualified doctors to go against all the ethics of their profession. And I really, quite honestly, I think a lot of doctors just wouldn't be willing to do it. And I think, we know some of the criminal actions that we've seen in the past. Are we going to have one doctor in a GP practice who does this? If it's not going to be performed by someone who's qualified, are we going to let these lethal drug cocktails be loose to people to administer to themselves, in which case they would just be floating around in wider community? That would be extremely dangerous. There's a lot more to this than simply saying, we just need to give people the choice of when to end their own lives. There's an awful lot more to this, and people need to be aware that, say, as I said earlier, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and if merely passing legislation made the world better, we would have one of the best societies in the world, because we've certainly got plenty of legislation. And what I always worry about is the unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences of allowing this bill to proceed to law is absolutely immense.
Peter Tatchell, listening to Andrew speak, it's clearly a very nuanced, very difficult, very sensitive situation for anyone to find themselves within. What would be the reality for a doctor, who's not, his own personal ethics prohibit him from assisting someone to end their life? What do you envision happening, where someone is asking to be helped out of this life? Perhaps their GP has a problem with that. Then there's the complications of the motivations of the wider family. It could potentially. It's fine the way you describe it. I completely understand it, the necessity for a decent death. But there are many, many ways in which the situation could be manipulated by bad actors.
Well, first let me say that 84% of the public and the vast majority of doctors support the right of a person to choose the timing and manner of their death. They say that just as we all expect a quality of life, we should also be entitled to a quality of death, that no one should have to suffer agonizing pain for weeks and months and years, that if they choose, with supervision and with coordination, to end their own life, that should be their choice. Now, under the bill that's proposed, the assisted dying bill of Baroness Meacher, there are very strong safeguards. An assisted dying would have to be approved independently by 2 different doctors. It would have to be authorised by a High Court judge. The person would have to be aged 18 or older. They would have to be of sound mind and to have clearly wished and expressed this over a period of time of their own free will. And on top of that, they would have to have the diagnosis of a terminal illness and be expected to die within less than 6 months. So under no circumstances would this bill allow relatives to pressure family members. Under no circumstances would someone simply decide they want to end their own life. There are very, very strong safeguards, and this kind of legislation has worked well in New Zealand, Belgium, and 6 Australian states. So I understand the fears, but let's not scaremonger. There are protections. No vulnerable person could be bullied into agreeing to take their own life because of greedy relatives under this legislation. It's got the protections there.
Andrew Eborn, are you persuaded of the watertight case that Peter Tatchell makes?
Well, I think
it's being beyond abuse.
No, I think there are a couple of points here. Is that obviously doctors absolutely have a fundamental obligation to do no harm, but also their obligation is to ease suffering. And what we're talking about here is sort of a dignified way to do it. The quotes that Andrew is talking about are horrendous. If people sitting at the bedside and waiting till granny dies so they can get the houses, of course that's appalling. What we're talking about, I think there is common ground here. We don't want people to suffer. What we want to do is to safeguard against the abuses. And the bill as it's currently going through, and as Peter eloquently put, they've got those safeguards in place. The other question, I've discussed this with you a number of times, is the seismic advances in medicine now mean that you can prolong life forever if you wanted to, and you can keep people alive. So the question comes along is, what is life? And it's about quality of life, not just quantity. And you need to look at that sort of side as well.
And to answer your previous question, no doctor would be compelled to assist someone to die. That would be of their own free choice. And those doctors who don't want to, they would not be required to do it. So, but there are plenty of doctors, the majority of doctors, who actually support this legislation.
So hypothetically, a person requiring or requesting assisted death would be, in effect, shopping around, perhaps, if their own doctor wasn't prepared to help. They would have to make alternative arrangements, which sounds uncomfortable, let's say.
Well, as I said, it would require the authorisation and approval of 2 different independent doctors. So if someone's own GP would not give that approval, then usually nowadays there's multi-practice GP surgeries, so probably another doctor within the surgery would be agreeable. But if that didn't work, then they could go to a different approved register and seek the advice and the commitment of another doctor. So it's all about giving people the right to die with dignity, to not have to suffer. Now, I say this as someone, I've seen 2 friends of mine suffer very prolonged, agonising deaths. You know, they had palliative care, but it wasn't good enough. I'm visualising now their grimaced faces with the pain, writhing sometimes in agony before my tears rolling down their face. It's terrible to keep people alive in those circumstances when they're going to die, when there's no cure, and when they're clearly suffering extreme pain. That's compassion.
And Andrew Bridgen, you and I have talked in another context about bodily autonomy more than once in relation to the medical interventions that were offered and pushed as vaccines during COVID. And bodily autonomy seemed to be shouted down loudly, people saying, my body, my choice. And yet here, this would very much seem to depend upon a person being able to claim bodily autonomy. Am I right in thinking there's a greyness there between, in the last 4 years, people were discouraged from considering that they had bodily autonomy, and that now those requesting assisted dying, a main plank of it would be my body, my choice, and it's being honoured in one and not in the other.
Well, I think it's when it suits the state, the rules can change. I am very concerned that there was involuntary euthanasia during the first wave of COVID-19. And we've talked on your programme, you gave us the airtime to bring in concerned relatives around NICE guideline NG163 and the midazolam and morphine. And clearly, I think, Matt Hancock has had some Damascene conversion, that he was always against assisted dying, but now he's suddenly for it. And I really do suspect people like his motives around this, when he's very clearly implicated in very serious questions about the potential euthanasia of tens of thousands of vulnerable elderly in early 2020.
Peter, how would you react to that? There certainly was conversation, and allegations have been made and counterclaims, and and it's been refuted and so on and so on. But there certainly was a time when people were saying, and they're still saying, that their relatives were shuffled off this mortal coil against their will and without the knowledge of the families, which serves to point up the potential danger when you invite the medical establishment to have that life and death power.
Well, that certainly was the case. And I know from my own experience, my own cousin had a decision taken by medical staff to withdraw food and water just hours before her sisters were due to arrive from Australia to her bedside. They effectively killed her just 5 hours before her sisters arrived. But that was not lawful. Well, put it this way, they got away with it, but, it wasn't lawful. And what happened during COVID wasn't lawful either. What we're now proposing is to set up a clear, lawful framework which would not allow anybody, either as a sick person themselves or relatives, to force something through without the oversight of 2 independent doctors and a High Court judge. No High Court judge is going to approve assisted dying without really strong evidence that someone has consented to it, that they have a terminal illness with less than 6 months to live, and that they have made this choice freely and consciously of their own free will. That's a very high bar. 2 independent doctors and a High Court judge.
Andrew, Eborn, that is troubling. Yeah. What Peter Tatchell is saying, we've all heard these stories about people who were nudged out of the exit door, but against their will.
Absolutely, and these cases are horrendous, and these are abuse. And I go back to the point I was saying beforehand, is that you need to look at more light, less heat. So what I would ask Andrew, and from that point of view, is that in what circumstances would he support assisted dying, assuming that we deal with all the abuse cases and get rid of those? Are there any circumstances where he would support it?
Or what does he think are the flaws of the current bill, Baroness Meach's bill?
To you, Andrew Bridgen, I mean, are there circumstances? Is it a straight no to you? Is it a straight no from you, from the very idea of these amendments? Or are there circumstances under which?
I honestly think it devalues life as a whole. Certainly for the individuals who have been asked to make that decision. I think it changes the complete ethos of the National Health Service, which I'd never want it to be the National Death Service. And remember, in 2014, we debated and Parliament decided to outlaw the Liverpool care pathway, which was the death pathway that elderly people were put onto. We're having vulnerability scoring, frailty scoring now in hospitals, where the vulnerable elderly are scored. And if they score over a certain number of points, which may be 6, they're put onto the terminal life pathway, which is, again, refused nothing by mouth, effectively starved and to death, and put on end-of-life drugs. This is the same organisation that's going to do all the rules properly and administer the assisted dying.
But Andrew,
I'm afraid, gentlemen, I'm going to have to jump in only because we've run out of time, but thank you both very much for that. A very sensitive consideration of perhaps one of the, a subject more emotive. It would be hard to imagine. Peter Tatchell, Andrew Bridgen MP, thank you very much.